my name is Lynn and I'm studying to be a BCBA. In today's video, we're going to cover Unit 3 of my class, and Unit 3 covers respondent relations. Now, respondent relations is only talking essentially about classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning, because it basically works off of the reflexes that we have innately in our bodies and how it reacts to the outside world. So everyone's heard of Pavlov, essentially, if you're in psychology, where he rang the bell and he gave the dog the food, and over time the dog associated the bell sound with food coming, so then the dog would salivate, and he measured that. That being said, the more technical terms would be there was an unconditioned stimulus, for instance like a puff of air on your eye, and an unconditioned response, which is your eye blinking. And unconditioned responses are innate, they're involuntary, and the term reflex will always describe the entire relationship. In layman's terms, whenever we say reflex, we think of an action, like, oh, we have fast reflexes, we caught a pen when it was falling, we jumped out of the way of a car if we saw them coming. That's fine, but in behaviorism, it actually means something a little different, where it's an innate response relationship. So respondent conditioning is creating a new innate relationship with our unconditioned responses to a conditioned stimulus. So for instance, with Pavlov, the unconditioned stimulus was the food. The dog saw the food, it knows it can eat it, so it salivates. That is an unconditioned, involuntary response to it. The bell was a neutral response. So neutral response is any neutral stimuli. A neutral stimulus is basically any stimulus that doesn't really have a history of any sort of responding elicitation. So to elicit is to bring out of the body and have the body react in such a way that is involuntary. So basically, the neutral stimuli is presented with the unconditioned stimuli every time it's presented together. So that's that stimulus contingency I was referring to in Unit 2. And over time, it's going to create a new conditioned response. So that new conditioned response for Pavlov was ringing the bell, and the dog hears it and he associated it with the meat, which is not being presented at the same time, and he salivates. So it basically goes over all the building blocks of what respondent or classical conditioning is. Sorry for the mixing of terms, but they are all used interchangeably, where it's respondent conditioning, classical conditioning, or Pavlovian conditioning. Those all mean the same thing, essentially. It's basically your body is responding immediately, involuntarily, to some sort of environmental change that's affecting the body by its receptors. There are several places that you are able to, several ways that you are able to create new conditioned responses. There's long delay, where you present the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, but they're like the presentation and offset barely overlap, and that will create a new relationship, but it usually takes a lot more opportunities for it to occur. The most common one is short delay, where you pretty much present the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus almost overlapping. Not quite exact at the same time, but almost overlapping, where you make sure you present the neutral stimulus first, and then immediately afterwards, before it even turns off, you present the unconditioned stimulus as well. That is guaranteed to create relationships very quickly. That's the fastest way you can create it. Simultaneous presentation is not very useful. That's when you present both the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus together. It's not going to create that strong of a relationship because it just seems like they're happening at the same time. So the dog might learn, but generally they won't. They'll hear the bell and they're like, oh, okay, cool. That happened at the same time that I got food sometimes, but it never happened just before. So basically what you're creating is almost like a warning stimulus in a way. But for those types of conditionings, you want to make sure that you do short delay or long delay. There's also trace conditioning, where you're supposed to do it afterwards. It's not really well known though. They've found some effectiveness in the labs, but they don't really have any real life examples of it ever happening where you show the neutral stimulus after the unconditioned stimulus. So that one doesn't really work as far as behaviorists know. Once again, there was some promise in some laboratory settings with some experimentation, but obviously it's not guaranteed, and they haven't been able to do enough research on that yet. There's also 4 ways that our reflexes, or our collection of reflex relationships can affect us. So the 4 instances that we cover are habituation, sensitization, adaptation, and potentiation. So these are when our reflexes respond to different environmental events, and they respond in such a way that change depending on what immediately happened before those events as well, or what happened during those events. So potentiation, the best way I can describe it as far as examples go, is the longer you get a tattoo, so the longer you are exposed to a continuous stimuli, the more you sweat. Now, I don't have a tattoo, but this is something a couple professors of mine actually mentioned as a really good example for potentiation. So your body doesn't stop responding, and in fact keeps responding to it as it continues on. So that's called potentiation. Sensitization is when you react to anything similar to what just happened. So let's say, for instance, you see a snake on the ground and you jump and startle. And then 5, 10, maybe up to a minute later, you see a piece of rope on the ground and you jump and startle at that too. Even though if it was just the rope on the ground, you wouldn't have been startled to begin with. A really popular example is you hear a firecracker or a car backfire and it startles you, and then immediately afterwards someone barks, or a dog barks, and it also startles you again, even though you're used to that dog barking. That is sensitization. So you've become more sensitive to that event stimuli. The next one is habituation, and I always mix this one up with adaptation, but I'll do my best to parse them. Habituation, the best way I can describe it is, imagine that there is a train track by where you live and the train goes by, but there's an onset and an offset every time. So the train comes by and then once it's gone, it's gone. So there's a start and an end to the event stimuli. Over time, even though the first few times you hear the train next to your house, it startles you a little bit or it makes you jump, over time you stop responding to it, right? You stop jumping to it. You're no longer, your reflexes are no longer like, ah! So you're habituated to it. But it can be temporary. If you move away for 2 years and come back to the same house, the moment the train comes back, it can elicit a startle response again, which is an unconditioned response. So it is more or less a temporary item. Adaptation, on the other hand, is semi-permanent. It's one of the only ones that's semi-permanent in this effect, where the best way to describe it, an example is the humidity in Florida. So if the humidity is constantly there and your body slowly stops responding to it, it's essentially the opposite of potentiation, where you are constantly being presented something and over time your body just stops responding to it. Another way to describe it is like the battle-hardened soldier, where they there's explosions going off everywhere and they're just, over time, they're getting used to it because it's not ceasing. It just keeps going. So those are the 4 respondent relations as far as the environment goes, right? And continuous exposure to the environment. And the last bit of Unit 3 was an introduction to John Watson, who's considered the father of behaviorism. But I will get more on him in another video. So pretty much all of Unit 3 was talking about the respondent relationships, operant conditioning, the building blocks of operant conditioning, what is a reflex, what's a conditioned stimulus, an unconditioned stimulus, and a neutral stimulus, and the 4 respondent relations within the environment that can continue on. So I will see you in the next video.